we're in big trouble. Okay, not KPFK, not specifically LA, the world, our Earth and our economy are in crisis, but you knew that. Essentially, we've created a bubble economy in which we're over-consuming the Earth's natural resources. And nowhere is this more evident than in the food sector. Record high temperatures, falling water tables are causing food production to decline. Most visible is the shrinking world grain harvest, which has been inflated by over-pumping aquifers, using up water quicker than it can be renewed, a practice that virtually guarantees a future drop in production once the aquifers are depleted. So we're in a race between tipping points in the natural world and tipping points in the political world. Which will come first? Can we mobilize the political will to phase out coal-fired power plants before the melting of the Greenland ice sheet becomes irreversible? Can we halt deforestation in the Amazon basin before it so weakens the forest that it becomes vulnerable to fire and ends up destroyed? Can we cut carbon emissions fast enough to save the Himalayan glaciers that feed the major rivers of Asia? And Asia, where so much of our population is dependent on those glaciers. Can we win this race? Well, today's guest, Lester Brown, thinks we can. In his new book, Plan B, 4.0, Mobilizing to Save Civilization, Brown lays out the symptoms, the diagnosis, and the cure. He estimates we could solve all the world's greatest problems for about $200 billion a year. Now, that is less than half of the U.S. defense budget, and I guess about a third of our stimulus plan this year. Plan B 4.0 is a comprehensive plan for reversing the trends that are undermining our future. And it has 4 overriding goals: stabilize climate, stabilize population, eradicate poverty, and restore the Earth's damaged ecosystems. Failure to reach any of these goals will likely mean failure to reach the others as well. So Lester Brown says it's time for Plan B, and he describes it as an all-out response at a wartime speed proportionate to the magnitude of the threats that we face. You can learn more at Earth Policy, one word, earthpolicy.org, where you can also download the entire book for free. Lester Brown has been described by the Washington Post as one of the world's most influential thinkers. After working with the Department of Agriculture and International Agricultural Development, he helped establish the Overseas Development Council. And then he founded Worldwatch Institute, which for many years has played an important role in the public's understanding of the trends in the global environment. They put out the annual State of the World report and annual Vital Signs, which is kind of a book of the numbers. Then in 2001, he left Worldwatch. He founded Earth Policy Institute, and he published Eco Economy, Building an Economy for the Earth. His other books include Who Will Feed China, Tough Choices Facing the Challenge of Food Scarcity, and his newest, the one we're talking about today, Plan B 4.0, Mobilizing to Save Civilization. During a career that began with tomato farming, Lester Brown has been honored with numerous prizes, including a MacArthur Genius Grant, the United Nations Environment Prize, Japan's Blue Planet Prize, along with 20 honorary degrees. Welcome once again, Lester Brown.
It's great to be back with you.
Thank you. As you know, I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we talk about. And a question that I've asked you in previous interviews, but I think is worth repeating, is how come you got involved in the global environment? I mean, if I go back to the early days of environmentalism, it was usually about cleaning up smog in L.A. or cleaning up the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, or maybe some local landfill that was, off-gassing or something like that. But you have this global approach. How did that happen?
It probably goes back to 1956, when I spent the last half of the year living in villages in India. My brother and I were growing tomatoes then, and he took care of the harvest that year. And I didn't realize at the time, but it really did begin to influence my thinking. And a few years later, I found myself headed for Washington to join the Foreign Agricultural Service, and spent 10 years working on international agriculture. So I was sort of rooted in the international approach to things early on. So then, a few years later, when I wanted to start the Worldwatch Institute, and discovered that the vice president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund saw a similar need for a research institute to work on global environmental issues. It just was came sort of naturally for me to think of it in those in global terms.
Very good. Now, a few years ago, I think 2001, when you started Earth Policy Institute, you wrote, I'm going to read this quote, "While the environmental community has gained a well-deserved reputation for successfully opposing certain policies or initiatives that it's against, it's less clear what the community is for. Without a vision, without a sense of where we want to go, it will be very difficult to get there." That was, I think, 8 years ago. Have things improved in that regard?
Well, there is a much greater awareness now of the global dimensions of environmental issues. And I think that's largely because of climate change, and people are beginning to see how what happens in one part of the world can affect people everywhere. And that's true with, I was just thinking and writing about the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. Now, who would think that the melting of the Greenland ice sheet would be a major threat to the rice harvest of Asia? And yet it is, because much of Asia's rice is produced in rice-growing river deltas that are very close to sea level. So if the Greenland ice sheet were to melt entirely, sea level would rise 23 feet. But even a 3-foot rise in sea level would cover half the rice land in Bangladesh and a good part of the Mekong Delta, which produces half of the rice for Vietnam, which is a leading rice exporter. I just mentioned those two delta situations, and there are another 20 rice-growing river deltas in Asia. But what happens to the Greenland ice sheet is of major concern for rice consumers.
So that the threat I mentioned in the introduction about the Himalayan glaciers, that and Tibetan glaciers, that's not the only climate change threat to Asia and Southeast Asia.
That's right. Interestingly, the rice crop, because it's grown in river deltas and vulnerable to sea level rise, and because nearly all the rice crop in Asia, indeed in the world, but 90% of it's grown in Asia, is irrigated. And so when we look at the glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau, we see that it's the ice melt from those glaciers that sustains the major rivers in India and China, for example, during the dry season, the Indus, the Ganges, the Yangtze, the Yellow. And not only does the ice melt from those glaciers sustain those rivers, but it sustains the irrigation systems dependent on those rivers. So what happens to those glaciers is of great concern to the people who live in countries like India and China.
This is, as I have said, Plan B 4.0. And I believe, Lester, we've talked as each version has come out, Plan B, 2.0, 3.0, and so on. Why so many revisions? Do things change that quickly? Or did you just get in that habit when you were putting out the State of the World every year?
A habit I couldn't break. Things are changing fast, and they're changing both in terms of our understanding of the problems and their dimensions. I could not have talked very knowledgeably, say, 4 years ago about the melting glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau and its effect on the grain harvests of China and India. I sort of knew about it, but we weren't aware that the glaciers were going so fast then. We know now. On the other side of the ledger, the development of renewable energy resources is moving at a rate and on a scale that we could not have imagined even 2 years ago. Just 2 or 3 quick examples. The state of Texas, which has long been the leading producer of oil and a source of oil for other parts of the United States,
as well as the center of the oil business, yeah.
Right, is now the leading source of wind-generated electricity, having passed California a few years ago. Texas today has 8,000 megawatts of wind capacity online, a couple thousand more under construction, and maybe 40,000 or so in the development stage. So an analysis by an energy research firm points out that altogether, when these wind farms are finished, we're looking at 50,000 megawatts of wind generating capacity. Those wind farms will provide more electricity than the 24 million people living in Texas can consume. And I mention Texas because we don't think of Texas as being an environmentally cutting-edge state, and it's not. But this is not being done because of climate change or the Kyoto Protocol or the upcoming conference in Copenhagen. It's being done because this is how you make money in Texas. They've got a lot of wind, and it's easy to harness it there. Another example would be China. China is a latecomer to wind energy, but in each of the last 4 years, it has been doubling its wind-generating capacity. But beyond that, there is a semi-government agency called the National Development Resources Commission, I believe it is. It's sort of a cabinet-level agency that kind of coordinates a lot of activities in the country, and one of them is the development of wind resources. And they have organized and planned the construction of 6 wind mega complexes, the smallest of which will have a generating capacity of 10,000 megawatts, and the largest of which will be nearly 30,000 megawatts. Altogether, these 6 complexes will be producing over 100,000 megawatts of wind-generated electricity, and that is equal to 100 coal-fired power plants. I mean, it is huge.
Wow.
We've never seen thinking on this scale before with renewables. But the real blockbuster is one coming from Europe. For probably close to 20 years now, I can't remember exactly, the Club of Rome has had this idea that Europe could tap the solar energy resources of North Africa in order to get much of its electricity. And as recently as last year, I was at 2 conferences, one in Rome and one in northern Germany, where this proposal was presented. And while I've always been sympathetic to it, I couldn't sort of see it getting much traction. But then on July 13th of this year, Munich Reinsurance, one of the largest reinsurance companies in the world, announced that it had formed a consortium of a dozen European corporations and banks, including Deutsche Bank, Siemens, ABB, and a number of other sort of major players. And the purpose, and what they're doing is creating a new organization to develop a strategy and a financial plan for harnessing the solar energy resources of North Africa to provide electricity for Europe, and also, I might add, for North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. But this is, and a German research firm says that Europe could economically get up to half of its electricity from solar thermal power plants in North Africa. It's just amazing to see the scale of this. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of megawatts of solar generating capacity. Now, the Algerians and the Germans have already started on something, a couple of years ago before this announcement was made. And the Algerians point out that they have enough harnessable solar energy in their desert, which is most of the country, to power the world economy.
Wow.
It sounds like a mistake, but this basic point appears in the energy literature when it's noted that the sunlight striking the Earth in 1 hour could power the world economy for 1 year. So I mention these examples just to give a sort of answer to your question. Are you doing the Plan B books every couple of years or so because things are changing fast? And the answer is yes.
And what I love is the fact that you're saying they're changing both in terms of new or newly realized threats or accelerated threats, but also, and maybe even more so, newly accelerated solutions, which is exciting. When you said that you could, by the way, I'm speaking with Lester Brown, and we're talking about the book Plan B 4.0, Mobilizing to Save Civilization. Now, Plan B, as we just said, he's been putting them out for the last few years. They basically give you the threats, give you the problems, but they're full of the emerging and accelerating solutions, which I think is a great thing for anyone's psychology, anyone's, if you're going to wake up and feel good in the morning. Also, as I said before, at earthpolicy.org, you can see the entire book and download the entire book. So that's also true to the notion of environmental stewardship. Let me ask you one other question that's slightly different, and that is, in addition to the new information, the new trends, that sort of thing, Lester, you've been at this a long time. You started off by saying, a dawning realization in 1956. Are you also having new realizations, new understandings? Are things changing in how you see things?
Yes. Example. From time to time, I go back and read about earlier civilizations that declined and collapsed and sort of the latest thinking on, how and why and so forth. And one of the things that you quickly realize is that more often than not, it was the food supply that was the weak link in most of these earlier civilizations, whether it's the Sumerians or the Mayans or what have you. But I had long rejected the idea that that food could be a weak link in our modern civilization. But beginning a year or so ago, as I was thinking about this, and I realized that the trends that are undermining our food security, like soil erosion, like falling water tables, collapsing fisheries, deforestation, expanding deserts, ice melting, rising sea level, disappearing mountain glaciers that feed rivers and so forth, I realize we've not turned around a single one of these trends.
Mm.
And one can say with great confidence that if we don't succeed in turning them around, then we will not be able to satisfy our food needs. No civilization has undermined agriculture's natural support systems and lived to tell about it. It takes a toll, and we're doing this now at the global level. And we're beginning to see some dramatic examples. I mean, I've always had a chapter on water and the extent of overpumping and aquifer depletion and so forth around the world. But last year, the Saudis, and this actually has its roots in the late 70s, when after the Arab oil export embargo, they realized that they would be vulnerable to a counter grain export embargo because they imported most of their grain. So they began looking around to see what they can do, and using their oil drilling technology, they discovered an aquifer about a half-mile down. That aquifer was a fossil aquifer. That is, it was water laid down, in geological eons ago, and it is now largely depleted. And they have been self-sufficient in wheat for more than 20 years. But last year they announced that aquifer was nearly gone and that they were going to reduce their wheat harvest by 1/8 each year until by 2016 they're basically out of the grain production business, and their Canada-sized population will be importing all its grain. Now, what's interesting about this is not so much its effect on the world grain balance, because the Saudis produce, less than 1/2.
They don't export much. It's for themselves. Yeah.
Right. It's only 1/2 of 1% of the world wheat harvest, so that's not a big deal. But what it does provide is a very clear view of the consequences of aquifer depletion. Whether it's a fossil aquifer, which when is depleted is gone, that's the end of irrigation, or if it's a renewable aquifer, as most aquifers are, then once you deplete it from overpumping, then the rate of pumping is necessarily reduced to the rate of recharge. And then you start looking beyond Saudi Arabia and you look at India. The World Bank study a few years ago pointed out that 15% of the people in India are now being fed with grain produced with irrigation water from overpumping. Stated otherwise, this means 175 million Indians are being fed from irrigation wells that will be going dry in the not-too-distant future. The comparable number for China is about 130 million because they're overpumping extensively under the North China Plain, which is sort of their breadbasket. So you start looking around the world, and suddenly you realize that water tables are falling in large parts of the world at the same time because our capacity to overpump aquifers is really a rather recent acquisition. It's post-World War II.
Based on technology?
Technology and pumps,
mm-hmm.
and the knowledge that you can pump water from way down if you have to. So anyhow, that's we're living in we have sort of a food bubble economy.
Yeah, that's the next thing I was going to talk about is the sort of the conceptual picture of what's going on here. But first, let me just say two things. One, when we talk about food, we're talking about water, soil, and population, really, right? And so it's those trends that lead to food scarcity, correct?
And climate. And climate,
of course. Mm-hmm. Let's shift to the bigger picture. You basically say that this idea of a global bubble economy, and you said that as far back as the first Plan B. I went back and looked. But in this one you write, our mismanaged world economy today has many of the characteristics of a Ponzi scheme. And how is that so? People are much more familiar with that concept than they may have been a year ago.
Right. A Ponzi scheme like the Madoff scheme takes in investment money from clients and presumably invests that in assets of some kind, shares of corporations or what have you. But it doesn't, in fact, do that, and it offers exorbitant rates of interest, much higher than the market rate. Instead of 6% or 7%, they offer 12%, so they get a lot of clients investing. And then they use that investment to pay these very high rates of interest and attract still more. But, in fact, they're not accumulating any assets. The money is flowing in from investors and then going out to pay the earlier investors this ongoing rate of 12% a year, which is simply not sustainable. And at some point, when they can no longer bring in enough new investment to keep paying this ever larger bill they've accumulated, it collapses, which is what happened in early December of last year with the Bernie Madoff's scheme, and I think it was involved at least $50 billion.
Right. And of course, since then, it seems like I read about another one every couple of weeks, that in fact there was a lot of this going on. And so how is that analogous to what we all are doing with the Earth?
We are paying out interest rates that are excessive. We're consuming, and as a result, we're consuming the resource base itself.
So we're consuming the principal. Yeah.
That's right. It's no longer just the interest. It's now the principal as well. That's what overpumping is about. That's what overfishing is about. It's what deforestation is about, and so forth. You can go on through the systems. And like any other Ponzi scheme, if we keep this up long enough, it'll eventually collapse.
And another thing I noticed in your description is that, like a Ponzi scheme, you can, at least for a while, create the impression that things are better than they used to be. Right? In other words, as you shift from whatever you had in terms of water to advanced pumping and irrigation, suddenly you have more water. As you get a new fishing technology, suddenly it appears you have more fish. So in fact, the present players in that game, whether it's agriculture, fishing, and so on, they're dealing in what really is a bubble.
Yes, and it provides a false sense of security. One of the problems we face in the world is that most policy decisions are made based on economic indicators, and so things look pretty good. But if you look at the environmental indicators underlie those economic indicators, the collapsing fisheries or the falling water tables, the eroding soils, and so forth, then it doesn't look so good. And that's what we try to do in Plan B, is to give a sense of what's happening, of what the real indicators are and what they mean for the future. And what the current system does is it provides a false sense of security. It makes us feel like Bernie Madoff's investors felt until December 8th last year.
Right.
They were feeling very good about their investments because they're getting 12% a year. Well, we're doing the same thing. We're feeling very good because our economy is growing or was growing, and our incomes were rising, and we're consuming more and more, and we're very happy. But it's an illusion, and at some point in the not-too-distant future, and I'm not talking about generations from now, but more likely years from now, and maybe not too many years, we're going to begin to realize that this Ponzi scheme will not hold up, and we're going to have to make some major adjustments.
In a 2002 study published by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, a team of scientists led by Mathis Wackernagel, who's been a guest on this show, concluded that humanity's collective demands first surpassed the Earth's regenerative capacity around 1980. So up until then, we were kind of in balance. As of 2009, global demands on natural systems exceed their sustainable yield by nearly 30%. So each year, we're using 30% more than can be replenished, and you can see where that leads us. Paul Hawken, that you quote, and Paul's the author of several books, The Ecology of Commerce, Blessed Unrest, and so on. And here's the quote: "At present, we are stealing the future, selling it in the present, and calling it gross domestic product. We can just as easily have an economy that is based on healing the future instead of stealing it. We can either create assets for the future or take the assets of the future. One is called restoration, the other exploitation." And then you say, I'm going to read a quote of your own now, that our global economy is on a collision path because of market forces, perverse incentives, and poorly chosen measures of progress. We rely heavily on the market because it is so many ways such an incredible institution. It allocates resources with an efficiency that no central planning body can match, and it easily balances supply and demand, but it does have some fundamental, potentially fatal weaknesses. Again, a little bit about how the market leads us down the path we're currently on.
Well, as I know, the market does a lot of things well. One of the things it does not do well is incorporate the indirect costs of providing the goods and services we consume. For example, if you buy coal-fired electricity, you pay the bill that is the cost of mining and transporting the coal and burning the electricity and getting generating the electricity and getting it to your home. But there's another bill that's going to come for the next generation, and that will be the cost of dealing with the climate change as a result of burning the coal. And I could use a gallon of gasoline in the same way. We pay the cost of getting the oil out of the ground, getting it to a gasoline refinery, an oil refinery, and then getting the gasoline to the local service station. We do not pay the cost of healthcare costs of treating people with respiratory illnesses from breathing the polluted air. We do not pay the costs of climate change. And what we need to do is to incorporate these costs into market prices so that the market tells the truth. The market's now being dishonest with us, and it's misleading us. It's creating a situation where we think we're doing well when, in fact, we're heading for decline and collapse.
So this is, in some sense, we're getting more detailed into how this Ponzi scheme works. You have in your book the numbers of what a gallon of gas actually would cost if we included the external costs that are not included. What is that?
Then we're looking at, instead of, say, $3, $12 or $15.
$12 or $15 a gallon is what it actually costs.
That's right. And
are there similar figures for food or rice or wheat or anything like that?
The calculations I've seen mostly deal with the energy sector because climate change is the big bill. Mm-hmm. That comes from burning fossil fuels. Now, we can also reduce consumption by moving down the food chain. Many of us live too high on the food chain for our own health anyhow, so moving down would be a desirable thing to do for both ourselves and for the planet. I've sometimes used the Enron example as well to illustrate our problem. I mean, Enron in the late 1990s was probably on the cover of more business magazines than any other corporation. It was the darling of Wall Street. Its earning reports went up quarter after quarter, and then in late 2001, some outside accountants began looking at Enron's books, and what they discovered was that they had developed some ingenious techniques for leaving costs off the books. And when they finally finished the audit, Enron, which had been the seventh most valuable corporation in the country, was worthless. Its stock had been trading for over $90, suddenly was trading for pennies per share. We are doing exactly what Enron did. We're leaving costs off the books. And it's dangerous because it gives the short-term impression that we're doing very well, when in fact we're not. And if we continue, we will have the same fate as Enron.
As Enron. And one of the things that I see in that is that when gas has gone up, and I assume will go up again fairly soon, to $4 or more per gallon, it is still only reckoning at that point with the increased cost of the cost it's counting, right? I mean,
that's right.
As the cost of refining went up, or the cost of production went up, or something like that, and the supply and demand. But that still leaves out any of these external costs that for which society will have to pay the bill. And you also point out that in addition to ignoring indirect costs, the market doesn't value nature's services. Now, that's a new concept probably to a lot of people. What do you mean by nature's services?
Nature provides a lot of services, and they're basically free. Example, flooding in the Yangtze River Basin, 1998, $30 billion worth of damage. Flooding went on for weeks, and the Chinese government kept saying, oh, well, it's an act of nature. But then by mid-August, they began to realize that there was more at play here, and they pointed out that the deforestation of the upper reaches of the Yangtze River Basin had contributed to this flooding, and that as a result they're going to ban the deforestation of river basins in China. In fact, ban deforestation, period. And the reason was that the value of trees standing in terms of flood control services was 3 times the value of the timber in those trees. Now, if you were doing a cartoon, you'd have one of those light bulbs, where the light goes on. Suddenly, they got it, and they realized that trees have many values, one of which is flood control, and that does not appear on the books. But they put it on the books with this ban on deforestation. That's
interesting, because if you ask people, they might say, oh, yes, in addition to, or the cost relative to timber is the cost of the forest as the world's lungs, as balancing carbon emissions and so on, but it's actually this flood control that, I mean, they could look at the price tag of $30 billion, right? And I went over this question when I interviewed Jared Diamond about his book Collapse, because he talks about this example, and he said that those flood damages affected, I think, 250 million people, which is a number that in America is mind-blowing.
Right.
And the other thing that we commented on, Lester, was that China could more easily ban deforestation than the United States could.
Well, the reason it could is because it turned to other countries for their forest products and proceeded to deforest them. So they were just moving the problem offshore, and so we have a lot of deforestation in northern Burma, in Siberia, in New Guinea, Papua, parts of Indonesia, to satisfy China's enormous appetite for wood. But the CO2 factor is, unlike the flooding, which was within China's borders, the cost of CO2 emissions from coal-fired power plants in China, for example, are shared. The cost of that in the form of climate change is shared by the entire world. So if the services are more local in nature, then they're more likely to be recognized as the Chinese did.
Let me ask you just one last question about this, which is that some people have said they're a little squeamish about putting a dollar value on nature services because they say they can imagine scenarios where that sort of monetization might actually cheapen something which actually is priceless. Your thoughts?
There are things that are priceless, and the survival of civilization could be in that category. I mean, one of the problems we face in the world today is that the stresses are building because of food shortages, rising food prices, water shortages, climate change, and the weaker governments are having trouble managing these stresses. And as a result, we have a growing number of failing states. Now, if I were to pick one indicator that will tell us more about our future than any other, it would be the number of failing states in the world. And that list grows longer year by year now. And the question becomes, how many failing states before we have a failing global civilization? We don't know the answer to that because we haven't been here before. We're in new territory now, as you indicated earlier from the Mathis Wackernagel's work. It was only around 1980 that the lines crossed and consumption of resources began to exceed the sustainable yield. But that gap is getting bigger and bigger now.
Mm-hmm. As people develop and as population increases. Let me ask, what is the role of the current global economic crisis in terms of confronting and dealing with environmental and resource issues? On the one hand, I would imagine it lessens demand, it lessens how fast we're using things. On the other, does it lessen the resources or the finances we have to devote to the changes we have to make?
You know, it is very difficult analytically to separate some of these causes. We are, let me see how to put this, the same set of values that leads to fiscal deficits also leads to ecological deficits. And one of the sources of the of this current economic downturn has been the excessive debt, whether it's in the mortgage market or consumer expenditures generally in this country. But the values that underpin economic deficits and ecological deficits are the same. That is the willingness to consume today with little thought for tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, I see what you're saying is that basically the crises arise from that same thing, short-term thinking, and basically if one were to put, I've often said, if one were to put one word on what's gone wrong here, it's about risk. It was the misjudgment and just misuse around risk, and obviously that is crucial in everything we're talking about in terms of the environment.
It is, and we're handicapped with an accounting system, which is essentially an economic accounting system that doesn't measure many of these risks that we're facing, and what you begin to realize is that these risks are cumulative, as you pointed out with Mathis Wackernagel's analysis. In 1980, the books were pretty much in balance. Mm-hmm. But by 2009, suddenly we're consuming resources 30% faster than the Earth can regenerate them. And now I sense that there is a relationship between this overuse of resources, whether it's water or oil, which is a non-replenishable resource, or forest products or what have you, and the problem we have had in the economy for the last year and a half now. But it's difficult to put things together, and one can see a tightening oil situation. If the economy worldwide begins to improve, you can see the oil situation tightening again.
Right.
We're kind of on this roller coaster.
Mm-hmm. That's right. As certain things improve, actually other things will end up getting worse. Let's shift to the good news. You say that the world is in the early stages of two energy revolutions. The first is the shift to energy-efficient technologies, and the second is the shift to renewable sources. We spoke a little bit about that in terms of you cited work in Texas, Germany, China, and so on. Other things that you didn't mention that should give people some feeling that there's that there will be a light at the end of the tunnel, that will have the energy to actually put that light on.
Right. Well, one of the exciting things in the energy field are the potential gains in efficiency. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the lighting sector, where for many years we said, well, if you replace incandescents with compact fluorescents, you can reduce electricity use by, say, 75%. But now we have a still more advanced technology in the light-emitting diodes, or LEDs, that particularly if teamed up with smart sensors that turn lights off when you leave a room. If there's no one in the room, the lights go off. And what we now have is the possibility of shifting to LEDs and these smart sensors to cut electricity use for lighting by 90%.
90%.
90%. And one of the areas in which this is moving ahead on a large scale, and this may be the largest single project in the world, is the city of Los Angeles replacing all its old streetlights with LEDs. And the payback period for this will be about 7 years, and then the combination of electricity savings and maintenance savings will reduce expenditures by about $11 million a year, as I recall. What's interesting about these LEDs also is, and there's a commercial on this, if you install one of these LED lights when your child is born, that light will still be working when the youngster goes off to college.
Wow.
They last for a long time, and with street light maintenance, it takes a sizable crew in a city like Los Angeles to maintain. I think it's 130,000 street lights, and replace the bulbs as they go out. With LEDs, that maintenance drops down not to zero, but it gets down pretty close to it. So this is an example where you can save an enormous amount of electricity, do something much more efficiently, and make money in the process. Another area in which I think we're going to see some really exciting gains is with automobiles. We have grown up with a gasoline engine, which is extraordinarily inefficient.
Mm-hmm.
80% of the heat produced from burning gasoline, 80% of the energy is emitted as heat. Only 20% actually moves the car down the road. But with electric motors, which are about 3 times as efficient as gasoline engines, you get an enormous, not just a marginal, but a multiple jump in efficiency. And if we shift to plug-in hybrids and to all-electric cars, and run them largely on electricity from wind farms, we're looking at a fuel cost, the equivalent of a gallon of gasoline, about 75 cents. The economics of this are going to be very appealing to consumers once this gets going.
Now, let me ask a question that is something I don't know about. In other words, it would seem to me that China, India, some other countries are fastly moving toward the kind of relationship with the automobile that we have. They will probably never quite get there, but moving in that direction. Are they as quickly moving toward leapfrogging us and not sinking enormous resources into internal combustion engines?
Not quite, though China has recently announced a huge inner-city high-speed rail system. Sort of like Japan's or the ones we see in Europe and France and Germany and so forth. But for the entire country, they're making a huge investment, and that's a smart thing to do. Because it greatly reduces inner city, driving,
mm-hmm.
which takes a lot of fuel. The other thing is that China is the first country where plug-in hybrids have gone on the market. They went on last year in December. There's a car, BYD, Build Your Dream, I think it's called, that's manufacturing these cars. They'll be in this market probably next year. Warren Buffett, incidentally, is one of the major investors in this company. But there is still this feeling in developing countries like China and India that, to be affluent is to have a car. And I remember doing a seminar at, I think it was Tsinghua University in Beijing a few years ago, and I was talking about transportation, the need to restructure transport systems with more, mass transit and fewer cars and all this. And one of the graduate students said, "Are you saying that we can't all have a car?" He said, "This is our dream." I said, "It may be your dream, but if you are successful, it will be your nightmare."
Yeah.
Because if you imagine 1.3 billion Chinese with 3 cars for every 4 people, as we have, you can't imagine it. It would be, Chinese civilization would come to an end because of a huge traffic jam. It's a matter of rethinking mobility. What we want is mobility, not cars.
That's right. This is that notion that what we really want is the services of products, not the products themselves. We want the comfort of a carpet, not the fabric. We want the mobility, not the car, those sorts of things. Are we doing enough of that kind of thinking? Are we redesigning the way we think of our relationship to products and cities?
We're beginning to, but only beginning. I mean, as you know, California is now thinking about a north-south high-speed rail system to cut down on driving. And almost every major city in the United States is either building a light rail or subway or some sort of a mass transit thing, or expanding and improving on existing ones. And that is a first sort of nod in the direction. It's not a major step, but it's an important early step. And we're beginning to see the complete streets movement take root. That is, you have to design the transportation system, including streets, so they're not only automobile-friendly, but also bicycle-friendly and pedestrian-friendly. And we've not been doing that, especially in a lot of suburbs. And there's sidewalks in many suburbs in the United States. So if you want to walk, you have to walk in the street or in the road.
Right. Let me ask a couple of big questions. We've got about 3 minutes here. The first one is, are we redesigning the way that we live quickly enough? And I guess I'll just roll them into another. Can we mobilize fast enough to make the changes we've got to make, given the threats that face us?
We don't know. What we do know in looking at climate change, for example, is that in this country, in the last 2 years, we've reduced carbon emissions by 9%. And that's because of a 10% drop in oil use and an 11% drop in coal use, and a very slight increase in natural gas use. So that's partly the recession,
right?
But it's also partly wind farms coming online, gains in efficiency and electricity use and so forth. But we now have in the pipeline several things that are going to continue reducing carbon emissions. For example, the automobile fuel economy standards announced in February. Cars, I think it's 40 miles per gallon, or a 42% increase in fuel efficiency, and light trucks, SUVs and so forth, a 25% increase in efficiency by 2016. That's a major advance. And then with appliance efficiency standards, this is particularly interesting because for years the Department of Energy has declined to translate congressional legislation on appliance efficiency into regulations that corporations could use. So one of the first things Obama did was to issue instructions to the Department of Energy to get all this backlog of appliance efficiency standards translated into regulations that would actually implement the program. And then thirdly, we have all these incentives now for wind and solar and geothermal that are going to assure huge growth there. And fourth, the federal government itself is now going to set carbon reduction goals for its own operations. So we have these things coming now that are really exciting. Another thing that's happening is that the U.S. automobile fleet is starting to shrink. And this year, cars scrapped will total about 14 million, new sales about 10 million. So the fleet will shrink by about 4 million, which means about a 2% shrinkage in the overall fleet size. And I think that's going to continue for several more years. So we have a lot of things happening now, and a lot of forces at work. But we're headed in the right direction. The question is, can we move fast enough?
Right. And I even some of the good things you were mentioning seem to be part of the recession. And the question is, will we continue that movement once the economy loosens up a little bit? I think the other piece that's in here is all the talk about local versus global as a way of thinking about the way you live. Let me bring it to a close. The book is Plan B 4.0. Lester Brown's website is earthpolicy.org, where you can download the entire book. Thank you, Lester Brown. Keep up the good work.